There's a whisper that still lingers in the woods of Tennessee, a voice carried by the wind, soft as breath yet heavy with something ancient. It began in the home of the Bell family, where laughter once filled every room. But one night that laughter stopped, and the whisper began. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this story stay beside you, gentle as candlelight, guiding you through the haunted hush of history. The land around the Red River was peaceful once. In the early 1800s, mornings came wrapped in mist and the smell of tilled earth. The Bell family lived in a modest farmhouse of timber and hope, surrounded by fields that bent softly in the wind. John Bell rose before dawn each day, his boots brushing dew from the grass as the horizon turned gold. His wife, Lucy, hummed hymns while baking bread, her voice carrying like sunlight through open windows. The Bell children chased one another through the fields, their laughter echoing between oak and sycamore. Everything about their life felt untouched, blessed by quiet faith and the rhythm of honest work. Neighbors spoke of John Bell with respect, a man of dignity and calm strength. He was known for fairness, for the way he tipped his hat to strangers and never raised his voice, even when the harvest ran thin. But sometimes peace carries its own stillness, a silence so complete it can hide the first tremor of something wrong. It began with a feeling. John couldn't name it, but he sensed it, like a shift in the air before a storm. The dogs would growl at empty corners. The horses snorted nervously, refusing to enter the barn. And at night, when the wind slipped across the fields, Lucy thought she heard faint tapping along the walls, as though someone were gently knocking from the other side. At first, they dismissed it. Old wood creaks, wind moves strangely. The mind plays tricks when the candles burn low. But soon the sounds grew bold. Footsteps in the hallway, the rattle of chains, the sound of lips whispering close to the children's ears as they slept. John Bell, a man who believed in faith and reason, searched for answers. He checked every lock, every window, every board of the house. He prayed longer each night, his voice low, trembling just slightly as he asked for protection he couldn't name. Yet the more he prayed, the louder the disturbances grew. One night, his daughter Betsy woke screaming. She said something invisible had pulled her blanket away, slapped her cheek, and whispered her name. The next morning, the family gathered, pale and silent, each afraid to speak what they already knew, that something had entered their home. Neighbors began to whisper, too. Stories spread through the valley of strange voices, of doors slamming by unseen hands, of laughter that came from nowhere. Still, John refused to believe. "There is no witch in this house," he would say firmly. But deep down, a coldness had settled in his chest. As autumn came, the nights grew longer. The air held a stillness that pressed against the house like a living thing. The Bell family began to sleep closer together, afraid of the dark corners. Outside, the Red River shimmered under the moon, calm and indifferent, as though it had seen such things before. And one night, when all the house was quiet, John Bell heard his own name whispered, softly, clearly but from the darkness above his bed. The whisper came again, and so as the night deepened, his world, once simple, once pure, began to shift into shadow. John Bell sat up slowly, the mattress creaking beneath his weight. The room was pale with moonlight, dust floating in its glow. He held his breath and listened. The whisper had come from the rafters, soft as the rustle of a bird's wings. For a moment, nothing. Then again, a faint hum almost like a sigh. He rose quietly, not wanting to wake Lucy, and crossed the room with the lamp trembling in his hand. The flame threw long shapes across the walls. Nothing moved, no mouse, no wind through a gap in the wood. Only the sound again, closer now, threading through the air like someone breathing just beside his ear. When morning came, he said nothing. What words could he use? To name it would make it real. Yet that day, while tending the fields, he felt it watching him. The hairs on his neck lifted whenever he turned toward the tree line. The woods that had always seemed gentle now looked deeper, older, as though the light itself hesitated before entering. By evening, the children spoke of hearing someone walking in the attic. Slow, deliberate steps that moved from one end to the other. John took his rifle and climbed the narrow stairs, each step groaning beneath him. The air up there was thick with dust. Cobwebs swayed in the lamplight. He found nothing. But as he turned to leave, the floor behind him creaked, a single heavy step. He spun, raised the lamp, and saw only empty air. That night he prayed aloud, the words trembling from his throat. Lucy placed a hand on his arm, whispering that it would pass, that maybe a lost animal had found its way inside. But even as she spoke, the walls gave a low, dragging sound, as if invisible fingers traced along the wood. Days passed, each carrying a little more dread. Knocks began to echo in threes. At dusk, the house seemed to breathe. When the family gathered at supper, the plates would rattle gently. Then a soft voice began to hum a tune none of them knew. It was distant at first, almost like a memory heard through water. Then clearer, a woman's hum, lilting and strange, moving through the rooms like a wandering breeze. The children clung to their mother. John's eldest son tried to be brave, lighting every lamp in the house, but one by one, each flame went out as if pinched by unseen hands. The darkness that followed was not silent, it was full of listening. Lucy began to read verses aloud each night, her voice steady, her faith her shield. The presence would grow quiet while she read, then return afterward, as if waiting patiently for her to stop. It seemed to know their routines, to understand their fear, to feed upon it. One cold evening, Betsy Belle sat by the fireplace, combing her hair before bed. The room was warm, the fire low. She glanced at her reflection in the small tin mirror hanging beside the mantel, and saw, behind her, another figure, a pale outline, faint as smoke, watching. When she turned, it was gone, but the comb slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. That night she woke screaming again. Her hair twisted into knots as though someone had pulled at it while she slept. The next morning, John gathered his family and told them the truth. Something unnatural was in their home. He promised to protect them, though the words felt small against the invisible weight pressing on their lives. He went to the nearest church, spoke to the pastor in hushed tones, and asked for prayer. Soon, word spread through the valley. Some neighbors came to help. Others stayed away, crossing themselves when they passed the Bell farm. At first, the presence seemed to grow restless with the visitors, doors slamming, windows shattering without touch. But then, as though curious, it began to reveal itself more clearly. The knocks became replies. Ask a question, and 3 sharp raps would answer. Are you here? Tap, tap, tap. What do you want? Silence, then a faint drawn-out sigh. Each night brought a new layer of strangeness. Once the family heard the creak of a chair sliding across the floor upstairs. Another time, a heavy object fell, yet when they searched, nothing had moved. And through it all, John Bell aged faster than before. His once steady hands began to shake. He spoke less, slept less. He took to sitting on the porch at dusk, staring toward the woods. The river beyond, gleaming like silver glass. He would whisper softly, "Who are you?" But the only answer was wind and the far cry of a night bird. One evening, as the sky deepened to violet, a neighbor named James Johnson came to stay the night. "We'll put this nonsense to rest," he said, half smiling. They prayed together, then extinguished the lamps. The house grew quiet. Then knock, knock, knock. From within the walls, close enough to feel through the floorboards. Johnson stood frozen. A soft voice rose from the corner, clear as daylight. "John Bell!" It stretched the name until it broke into a low chuckle. The 2 men searched every inch of the house, hearts pounding. But there was nothing. No intruder, no trick. The sound seemed to come from the air itself. Johnson left before dawn, his face pale. "It's not of this world," he whispered before leaving. From that night on, the haunting no longer hid. It became bold, almost alive. Objects moved openly. The voice returned often, whispering, laughing, mocking prayers. It spoke John's name like a secret it owned. Still, life continued. Crops were tended, chores done, children sent to school. But everything they did felt different now. Watched. Even the sunlight that touched the fields seemed thinner, like the warmth had drained from it. Sometimes Lucy would sit alone at the table after everyone had gone to bed, her hands folded tight, listening to the faint tapping along the windows. She would whisper, "What do you want from us?" The answer never came in words, only a cold gust that brushed her cheek like a passing hand. And so, as another winter crept upon the valley, the Bell family's nights grew longer. The voice grew bolder. What began as whispers had become conversation, and the house, once filled with laughter, now held its breath, waiting for what the dark would bring next. Winter settled hard over Red River, blanketing the fields in silence. Frost clung to every fence post, and the mornings came without birdsong. Inside the Bell house, the fire burned longer, but its warmth felt thinner, as though something unseen drew the heat away. The family spoke in whispers now. Even laughter, when it came, seemed to vanish quickly, swallowed by the still air. Then one night the silence broke. Lucy was reading by lamplight while the children drifted toward sleep. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a small brass clock. Suddenly a voice floated through the room, clear, deliberate, unmistakably human. "I'm here." The words came from nowhere and everywhere at once. John Bell rose so fast his chair fell backward. The children froze. The lamp's flame flickered violently, throwing shadows that twisted like living things. No one spoke. The silence that followed was heavy, pulsing, almost waiting. Then the voice again, this time softer, almost playful. "Don't be afraid." Lucy clutched the family Bible to her chest. Her lips moved silently in prayer. John stepped forward, heart pounding, and said, "Who are you?" A long pause. The air itself seemed to tighten. Then came the answer, drawn out, mocking, like a smile that didn't belong to any face. "You know me." From that night on, the voice became a presence. It whispered during meals, hummed through walls, called each family member by name. Sometimes it laughed, a dry, breathless sound that slid through the rooms like mist. Other times it would cry, low and mournful, as if remembering something ancient and lost. Neighbors who doubted soon came to hear for themselves. They would sit in the parlor, candles trembling, while the unseen voice answered questions. When one man demanded proof that it was real, it repeated every word of a sermon preached that same day. Miles away, in perfect rhythm and tone. Another time, it sang a hymn none of the bells had ever heard, in a woman's voice filled with sorrow so deep it left the listeners trembling. The voice grew confident. It teased, it scolded, it told stories of distant lands and long-dead souls. It knew things it could not have known, the secret thoughts of the children. The private prayers Lucy whispered before dawn. When asked its name, it laughed lightly and said, "I am what you fear and what you've forgotten." Yet, at strange moments, it seemed almost kind. Once, when one of the younger children fell ill, the voice softened and murmured through the night, "Sleep, little one. The morning will bring light." The fever broke by sunrise. Lucy wept, unsure whether to thank or curse the unseen guest. John Bell's health began to falter. His hands shook more often. He complained of numbness, of a heaviness in his chest. Whenever he prayed, the voice would interrupt, repeating his words backwards, mocking the rhythm of faith. Sometimes it would whisper, "Soon." Despite the fear, people came from miles around, preachers, soldiers, skeptics, all drawn to the Bell home. Each left pale and shaken. One minister declared it the work of a spirit caught between this world and the next. Another swore it was a demon sent to test them, but the voice refused to fit into their words. It seemed amused by their arguments, laughing softly from the dark corners of the room. Still, amid the unease, there were moments of eerie calm. On certain nights, when the fire burned low and the wind outside fell still, the voice would tell stories of battles long past, of ships lost at sea, of love and betrayal. The Bells would sit motionless, listening. It spoke like someone remembering life itself, every word tender and ancient. Betsy, the youngest daughter, felt it most. Sometimes she would wake to find her blanket neatly folded beside her bed, or her hair braided by unseen hands. Other nights, she woke to find bruises on her arms as if gripped tightly in sleep. The voice called her by pet names, sang to her, then turned cruel without warning, mocking her tears, laughing when she prayed. John Bell's oldest son, Richard, began to record everything, the sounds, the words, the moments of calm and chaos. He wrote that the voice seemed both intelligent and unstable, capable of kindness and rage within a single breath. One evening, he asked it directly, "What do you want from us?" The air trembled. The fire hissed low. Then, in a voice suddenly low and cold, it answered, "I came for him." John looked up slowly. "For me?" he asked. The silence that followed was worse than the voice itself. It stretched until the house seemed to hold its breath. Then came the faintest sound, like fingers tapping, across the table in rhythm to a heartbeat. and a whisper, close enough for only him to hear. "Yes, for you." From that night on, the spirit's attention turned entirely toward John Bell. He could not escape its voice. It followed him to the fields, murmuring through the rustling corn. It hissed through the rafters while he ate, repeating his every word with mocking precision. Sometimes, when he walked the road toward town, he felt invisible hands press against his shoulders, halting his steps. Lucy grew pale and sleepless, the lines around her eyes deepening. She refused to leave John's side, even as neighbors urged her to take the children and go. "We will not abandon him," she said softly. "Whatever this is, it began with us, and it will end here." The voice heard her. That night it whispered into the dark, almost admiringly, "You're brave, Lucy. Braver than the rest." Then, almost tenderly, "But bravery won't save him." The next morning, John's body trembled with fever, though no sickness could be found. His speech faltered, his steps grew uncertain. The spirit no longer hid in corners or shadows. Its laughter filled the house openly, echoing down the hallways like a melody only madness could compose. Outside, the Red River rolled on, silver under the pale sun, quiet and eternal. The fields lay bare, the trees skeletal against the sky. The world around them seemed to wait, patient, cold, and knowing. And as dusk fell again upon the Bell home, the voice returned one final time that night, low and close to John's ear. "Soon you'll see me." And so, as the candlelight trembled across the wooden walls, the first chapter of the Bell haunting reached its shadowed turning. The winter of 1818 hung heavy over Red River. Frost jeweled the fences, and the breath of every horse rose like ghosts into the morning air. Inside the Bell farmhouse, the fire burned low, whispering as if even the flames feared to speak too loudly. The children no longer played after dusk. Lucy moved through the rooms like a quiet prayer, setting candles in every corner. And John Bell, once proud and steady, sat more often by the window, staring into the dark that seemed to stare back. The voice had become part of their days now. It no longer waited for night. It spoke from rafters while Lucy kneaded bread. It hummed through the kitchen as Betsy poured water from the well. Sometimes it called to them from outside the window, gentle and coaxing, as though it wanted to be let in. It was not always cruel, and that somehow made it worse. Neighbors still came, drawn by curiosity, disbelief, and a secret thrill they could not name. They crowded into the small parlor, the scent of cold earth and candle wax thick in the air, while John Bell's sons read aloud from the Bible. The voice would wait until the final verse, then mimic the passage perfectly, but backwards, each word crisp and mocking. People gasped. One woman fainted. When the minister demanded, "If you are evil, declare yourself," the spirit laughed, a sound both sharp and musical, and said, "Evil? I am what you make of me." The sound of it seemed to tremble through the floorboards, through the nails that held the house together. Even after the voice fell silent, its echo stayed behind, soft as breath against the ear. The visitors left pale, crossing themselves in the yard. And yet more kept coming. Every week the Bell house filled with strangers who wanted to hear for themselves the talking spirit of Tennessee. By candlelight they sat, whispering questions into the dark. The voice answered them all, names, dates, memories no one had spoken aloud. It told one man the contents of a letter locked in his desk 3 miles away. It predicted the return of a long-lost relative who arrived days later. Skeptics left shaken. Believers left certain that they had spoken to something far beyond human. Lucy watched it all with quiet grief. Her home, once warm with song and laughter, had become a stage for fear. At night she lay awake, feeling the house breathe around her. Sometimes the voice whispered comfort. "I mean you no harm, sweet Lucy," and she almost believed it. But when she prayed, the tone turned cold, hissing through her words, twisting scripture into mockery. For Betsy, the haunting had grown crueler. Invisible hands tugged at her hair, slapped her cheeks, pulled her covers away. She would wake with red marks on her arms, small bruises shaped like fingertips. The spirit teased her endlessly, calling her my girl, laughing when she cried. John forbade anyone to speak of it outside the family. But by then, secrecy was impossible. The valley buzzed with gossip. "The Bell's witch can speak. She knows all things. Among those who came to witness was a young soldier named Andrew Jackson, curious and bold. He arrived with a small group, their wagon rumbling down the frozen road. When one wheel stuck in the mud near the Bell property, the horses refused to move. Jackson joked, "Maybe your witch has us now." At once, a woman's voice drifted through the air. "Yes, General, and you'll move when I choose." The horses jolted forward as if released from a grip. Jackson and his men slept uneasily that night, every candle guttering though no wind stirred. By morning they left without ceremony. He would later tell others quietly that he had no wish to meet the Bell Witch again. For John Bell, the days blurred into a slow unraveling. He spoke less each week. His eyes grew distant, fixed always on the middle distance, as though seeing something the rest could not. At times he would murmur to himself, answering questions no one had asked aloud. Lucy would touch his arm and whisper, "John," and he would blink, lost, as if returning from a faraway place. The voice followed him everywhere now. In the fields it whispered between the stalks. Soon. In the barn it laughed, knocking tools from their hooks. At night it repeated his own prayers back to him. Soft and cruel, "Deliver us from evil, if you can." Yet there were moments, strange, tender moments, when the voice seemed almost human. It would hum the lullabies Lucy once sang to her children. It would speak of stars, of rivers, of the hush between heartbeats. "Do you know what silence really is?" it once asked John. "It's the sound of everything waiting." Then, quietly, "I've been waiting a long time." The family lived between terror and wonder, caught in a haunting that felt less like punishment and more like conversation with the unknown. Faith began to tremble beneath its own weight. Even the ministers who visited left doubting their scriptures. Was this spirit damned or divine? A curse or a mirror showing men their own fear? As the cold months dragged on, the voice grew stronger, more present. It began to predict storms before they came, births before they happened, deaths before they were spoken of. Every prophecy proved true. The Bells no longer questioned whether it was real. They questioned what it wanted. And sometimes, when the night grew very still, when even the crickets dared not sing, the voice would whisper a single phrase, soft, rhythmic, almost tender, like a secret shared only with the dark. "John Bell, I am near." Then the wind would rise, rattling the shutters, and the lamps would flicker out one by one. And so, as another winter bled into spring, the Bell Witch's voice became the most feared and fascinating sound in Tennessee, a voice that spoke of things no living soul could know, and of a fate that crept ever closer to the man who tried to ignore it. And so, as the wind grew quieter across the Tennessee hills, the Bell family tried to return to life as it once was, but the nights would not let them. The silence had changed. It now listened. The first whispers began in the corners of the Bell home. Faint, curious, almost like the sound of a sigh slipping between floorboards. At first, they thought it was the settling of the old wooden house, the breath of winter through unseen cracks. But soon, the whispers began to speak. They said names. They laughed softly in the dark. And sometimes they echoed prayers that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Elizabeth Bell, known as Betsy, was the first to hear them clearly. She was just a girl, bright and kind, the sort who believed the world was gentler than it truly was. At night, she'd wake to her name being whispered from the corner of her room. The first time she thought it was her brother playing a cruel trick. But when she turned, no one was there, only the faint shimmer of moonlight touching her quilt. The whispers grew bold. They began to travel through the walls, from one room to the next, weaving through the wooden beams like a living thing. "Who are you?" her father asked one night into the emptiness. A pause. Then in a voice clear and mocking, done a woman's voice, calm and amused, came the answer, "I am the one who was wronged." The Bell family froze. The firelight flickered low. Outside, the cold wind stopped for a breath, as if even the night waited to hear what came next. Over the following weeks, the unseen voice became bolder, moving things, pulling blankets, laughing softly when prayers were read. It could sing hymns, quote scripture, even recite entire sermons. The neighbors came to listen. Some said it was a spirit sent to punish. Others said it was a witch's curse. Yet none could deny the chill that filled the air when it spoke. The Bell Witch, as she came to be known, wasn't just haunting a house, she was conversing, learning, weaving herself into the family's every breath. John Bell, the father, grew pale and withdrawn. He prayed more. He stayed awake through nights that stretched endlessly, listening to the murmurs crawl across the ceiling. "You can't hide from truth," the voice would say softly. "You know what you did?" But no one understood what truth she meant. Sometimes Betsy would wake with her hair tangled in knots, pulled by invisible hands. Sometimes dishes would shatter in rooms no one had entered. The air inside the house thickened, not just with fear, but with a strange sorrow, as if something long buried had finally begun to stir awake. And yet, there were moments of eerie tenderness. The witch would sing lullabies to the youngest children when storms rattled the windows. She'd murmur old proverbs about love and sin, about truth and forgiveness. Her voice was not always cruel, but it was never kind. By now, travelers were arriving from miles away to witness the impossible. Priests, scholars, skeptics, all came to the Bell Farm to hear the voice that spoke from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some claimed it spoke secrets no one could know. One man said it called out his mother's name, a name never spoken in Tennessee. Another swore he felt her cold fingers brush his cheek. The Bell Witch was no longer a story whispered by firelight. She was real, alive in sound and movement, and she had chosen this family for reasons no one could yet see. Still, in the quiet hours, Betsy found herself feeling something strange. Pity. Whoever this spirit was, her voice carried sadness like someone forgotten, someone left behind in a world that never listened. "Why do you haunt us?" Betsy asked once, her voice trembling. The answer came softly, almost lovingly, "Because someone must remember." That night, the house creaked as if it exhaled. The family huddled together, the candlelight flickering over their faces, shadows trembling on the walls. The whispers returned, slow and rhythmic, wrapping the house like a dark lullaby. And as the wind brushed the trees outside, the Bell family realized this haunting wasn't ending. It was only deepening, becoming part of them. The voice had roots now, and like the old oak trees outside, it would not let go easily. And so, as another dawn began to creep through the mist, the Bell home sat still, a wooden heart beating softly beneath, a sky that no longer felt empty. By the time autumn spread its copper light across the Tennessee fields, the Bell Witch had made herself at home within the air itself. Her voice drifted like smoke, sometimes gentle as a sigh, sometimes sharp as glass. The Bell children had stopped speaking of her openly, as if words might summon her from the shadows. But she was always there, always listening. John Bell began to keep a small journal by candlelight, his trembling hand marking down every strange event. Chairs that moved on their own, footsteps that circled the bed at midnight, laughter that echoed from the rafters. Yet between the written lines, the real story bled through: fear, guilt, and the sense that whatever haunted him knew something buried deep within his past. At first, the neighbors believed the tales were exaggerations, but then they heard the voice for themselves. One evening, as guests gathered near the Bell hearth, the spirit began to speak aloud, clear as day, recounting a sermon word for word, even mimicking the preacher's tone. The room fell silent. No human throat could form sound that way, floating disembodied above the air. "Do you believe me now?" she whispered, and the candles flickered low. Soon the haunting became less spectacle and more sentence. Betsy Bell, the young daughter, bore the brunt of it. Her hair pulled, her body pinched by unseen hands, her nights broken by whispers calling her name again and again, sometimes soft, sometimes screaming. Her laughter faded. Her childhood was slipping away, piece by fragile piece, to something that neither touched nor forgave. John Bell tried to stand between his family and the spirit, praying louder, shouting verses into the darkness. But the witch only laughed. "You can't silence what you owe," she hissed, her voice echoing through the beams. "The earth remembers every wrong buried within it." No one understood her words, not yet, but they felt their truth like frost creeping across the skin. The Bell Witch began to show a strange fascination with Betsy's growing love for a young man named Joshua Gardner, a gentle soul, steady and kind. When Betsy spoke his name, the spirit grew agitated. Doors slammed, dishes shattered. Her voice shrieked through the night, "You will not marry him!" Betsy's tears fell silently into her pillow as the witch's words wove through her dreams. She didn't know why the spirit hated her happiness, only that it did. The more she tried to ignore it, the closer the presence seemed to come, breathing just behind her ear, whispering threats she could not bear to repeat. Outside, the hills began to whisper too. Travelers claimed to hear voices among the trees, murmurs that rose from the ground like wind through hollow roots. The Bell Land, once warm and full of life, now felt heavy, as though the soil itself was mourning something long ago forgotten. In the town of Adams, word spread that the Bell Witch could appear, miles away, and still speak. From the air of the Bell home, she could recite a conversation held in another house, mimic a person's tone, even predict events that had not yet occurred. A trick of the devil, some said. A punishment, said others. But all agreed on one thing. No ordinary spirit could move between walls and voices with such knowing precision. And yet even in her cruelty, the witch's voice sometimes trembled, as though burdened by its own memory. Once when Betsy wept quietly in her room, the spirit whispered, "I too was a daughter once." Then silence, a deep, aching silence that hung heavy in the corners. That night the Bell house was still. No footsteps, no laughter, no movement at all. Just the steady heartbeat of a family suspended between fear and pity. John Bell sat awake until dawn, his candle burning low, staring into the flame as if it could answer what no one else could. Why them? Why this land? Why this voice? And perhaps deep within that question lay a truth the witch already knew, that hauntings are rarely born of malice alone. Some grow from memory, some from injustice, and some from the quiet ache of being forgotten. As winter drew near, the haunting took on a new shape, more intimate, more vengeful. The whispers began to follow them outside the home, at the well, in the fields, in the whisper of dry leaves underfoot. Her presence followed like a shadow stitched to their breath. Even the animals grew uneasy. Horses refused to go near the barn. Dogs barked into empty air. Chickens scattered as if something unseen walked among them. The Bell family, once proud and steady, began to crumble under the weight of something they could neither fight nor flee. And still the voice lingered, softer now, almost sweet. "You cannot hide from truth," it said one night, its tone almost mournful. "And truth cannot hide from me." Outside, the wind sighed across the Tennessee hills, long, low, and endless. Inside, the last candle flickered out, and the darkness deepened around them. And so, as the house fell into silence once more, the Bell family realized that the witch was no longer visiting. She was home. By the time winter came again, the Bell house no longer felt like a home. It was a waiting room between worlds, a place where every creak, every shadow seemed to breathe with intent. The walls that once echoed with laughter now carried whispers like veins of sorrow. Even the sunlight, when it spilled through the windows, seemed dull, as though the light itself was afraid to enter too deeply. John Bell, the father, had grown quiet. His once strong frame now trembled. His eyes, once sharp and full of dignity, seemed clouded by something unseen. There were moments when he would lose his speech, moments when he would fall, convulsing, his lips moving but no sound coming out. The witch watched. She never stopped watching. At first she mocked him. Her voice would coil around him when he prayed. "Do you think heaven listens to liars?" she'd whisper. "Do you think mercy belongs to men like you?" He never answered aloud. He only closed his eyes, gripping his worn Bible tighter, as though it could shield him from something much older than sin. The family could do little. Betsy tried to help her father through his spells, pressing cold cloths to his forehead, whispering prayers she barely believed anymore. But the witch laughed through the walls, her voice a cruel lullaby. "He deserves his rest," she murmured. "I will grant it soon." Outside, the fields froze beneath pale light. The trees stood like black bones against the sky. The Bell farm, once full of the hum of life, now lay still, silent, waiting. And the witch grew bolder. She began to mimic the family's voices perfectly, calling to Betsy from another room, then laughing when the girl came running. "I can be anyone," she said. "I can be everything." One morning, John awoke to find the witch sitting at the foot of his bed, invisible, but undeniable. The room was cold enough that his breath hung in the air like fog. "Why do you torment me?" he whispered. "Because you remember me," she answered softly. "Even if you pretend you don't." He did not know what that meant. Or perhaps he did, somewhere deep within the places memory dares not look. But he said nothing more. The next weeks passed in fragments of dread. The witch's voice changed tone from anger to almost affection. She began to call John Old Jack as if she were speaking to an old friend. She'd sing to him when he was too weak to rise from bed, her voice hauntingly sweet, humming old hymns with strange tenderness. "Rest now," she'd whisper. "Your time draws near." Neighbors came and went, whispering prayers, bringing food that went untouched. The Bell home had become a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the terrified alike. Some claimed they heard her voice calling from the air. Others said they saw objects move by themselves. But no one, not even the bravest preacher, could banish what lived there. One morning, Lucy Bell, John's wife, found a small vial beside his bed. It was half filled with dark liquid like ink, but thicker. The witch laughed from the corner unseen. "I gave him something," she said. "He will never rise again." John's breathing had slowed. His skin was pale as the frost that covered the fields. The family gathered around him, praying, weeping, pleading. But the witch's laughter swirled through the air, rising and falling like a cruel song. "He is mine," she said softly, "and I am satisfied." When John Bell finally took his last breath, the air in the room grew still, unnaturally still, as though time itself bowed its head. Then, from the shadows, her voice came one last time. "Justice has been served." That night, while the family grieved, the witch's laughter carried across the fields. Neighbors miles away swore they heard it, low, echoing, almost joyful. A sound that lingered even after the wind had died. In the days that followed, the Bell home became strangely quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no laughter. It was as if the spirit had finally gotten what she came for. And yet the silence was heavier than the noise had ever been. Betsy often stood by her father's grave at dusk, her breath misting in the cool air, wondering what secret had bound her family to that voice. She thought of the words the witch had once spoken. "You remember me." But no one knew who she truly was. Some said she was Kate Batts, a neighbor woman who'd once quarreled with John Bell over land. Others believed she was something older, something born of the hills themselves, a spirit of the land wronged and unforgotten. But truth, like mist, never holds still long enough to be caught. And so, life in Adams moved forward. The fields thawed, the seasons turned. But the Bell family would never be the same. Their name had become a whisper, a warning, passed from one generation to the next. The witch was gone, or so they said. Yet sometimes, when the wind passed through the hollows, you could almost hear her voice again. Soft, distant, carried by memory. And as night deepened, the Bell home still stood old and quiet, like a wound that time itself had learned to avoid. After John Bell's death, the air in the house turned hollow. Every room seemed to hold the echo of his last breath, and though the witch's voice had faded, her absence felt louder than her laughter ever did. The family tried to move on. They prayed, they worked the land again. They spoke softly, as if sound itself might wake something sleeping in the walls. But silence, when it settles too long, begins to whisper. Betsy, still haunted by what she'd seen and heard, often walked the fields alone. The frost-covered grass sparkled like scattered glass under the morning light, and sometimes, when she paused to listen, she could swear she heard her father's name carried faintly on the wind. She wanted to believe it was just memory, but deep down, she knew the witch had not gone. Strange things began to happen again. Small, quiet things. The front door would open by itself just before dawn. A chair would rock gently without touch, and at night, when the wind moved through the chimney, it carried a rhythm too precise, too knowing, to be chance. Betsy tried to ignore it. But one night, as she lay awake beneath her quilt, she heard a soft voice beside her ear, the same voice she'd grown up fearing. "You will not forget me," it said. Her breath caught. For a long moment she could not move. Then, as tears welled, she whispered, "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was almost kind. Then came the words, "To remember what your father did." The next morning, Betsy found footprints in the frost outside her window, small, bare, as if a woman had walked across the frozen ground in the middle of the night. They led toward the woods, then disappeared near the riverbank. In town, people spoke in hushed tones. Some said the witch had followed Betsy, bound to her like a shadow. Others whispered that the Bell curse would pass down through blood from father to daughter, generation to generation. Betsy tried to drown the rumors with reason. But reason does not quiet the dark. Joshua Gardner, the young man she had once loved, tried to stay near her. He was patient, kind, but the witch despised his presence. Whenever he came to visit, strange noises filled the room, the groan of wood, the rattle of glass, the mocking sound of laughter just out of sight. Once, as Joshua reached for Betsy's hand, a voice hissed between them, sharp and low, "If you love her, you will leave." The moment froze him. His eyes widened, his breath stopped. Betsy felt the air shift, colder, tighter, as though the world itself had drawn a line between them. He left that night pale and shaken, and did not return. Betsy didn't cry. She simply sat in the quiet and let the stillness close around her. In that moment, she understood what the witch wanted, not just vengeance, but remembrance. The spirit was not only haunting the living. She was demanding to be known. Weeks passed. Betsy's mother, Lucy, grew frail, worn by grief and sleepless nights. The Bell home, though quieter, never truly rested. Doors still creaked open in the dark, and sometimes a soft, lilting hum would drift through. The halls, a woman's voice singing an old hymn of mercy. It was almost beautiful. Almost. One night, near the anniversary of John Bell's death, Betsy dreamed of the river. She saw a woman there, her face pale, her dress soaked through, her eyes bright with fury and sorrow. "He took what was mine," the woman said. "He thought no one would remember." When Betsy tried to reach her, the figure faded into the mist. She awoke with her pillow damp, her chest heavy, her pulse racing like she'd been running. The witch was not gone. She was showing Betsy pieces of her truth, fragments of a story lost to time. And as Betsy pieced together the whispers, she began to see that her father's curse had not been born from random cruelty. The witch's vengeance was rooted in injustice, in something the earth itself had chosen not to forget. Some nights, Betsy would speak softly into the air, asking the witch what really happened. "Tell me," she'd whisper. "Tell me what he did." But the witch would never answer directly. Only echoes, "You already know." The haunting began to change its shape. Less violent now, more sorrowful. The whispers turned to sighs. The cold touch became softer, almost like a hand resting on her shoulder. Not in malice, but in mourning. Betsy came to understand something terrible and tender, that the Bell, which had never truly wanted to destroy them. She wanted her story to be remembered, her pain acknowledged, her silence undone. By spring, Betsy decided to leave the Bell home. Before she did, she stood alone in her father's room, her hand resting on the wooden post of his bed. "I don't hate you," she said softly into the air, "but I will not carry your secrets any more." The house was still. Then came one last whisper, faint, distant, and almost at peace. "Then I can rest." The wind shifted. The air warmed, and for the first time in years, Betsy felt the house exhale. She left the next morning at dawn, the mist curling low over the fields, the sound of birds breaking the long silence. Behind her, the Bell home stood empty, its windows catching the pale sun like tired eyes finally closing. But somewhere far across the hills, in the hush of moving air, a single voice lingered, not cruel, not mocking, just whispering softly, "Remember." And so the Bell Witch faded, not into nothingness, but into legend. When Betsy Bell left the house on that pale spring morning, she believed she was walking away from the haunting forever. But hauntings rarely live only in walls. They follow the heart, lingering in memory in the quiet corners of thought. And though she moved far from the Tennessee hills, the whisper of that place never truly let her go. Years passed, soft and slow. Betsy married another man, a kind teacher who loved her silence as much as her words. Together, they built a modest home far from the Bell farm, where the land no longer trembled beneath its own past. Yet sometimes, when the wind moved through the trees just so, Betsy would pause, feeling a presence near her shoulder, as familiar as breath. It wasn't anger anymore. It was remembrance. In the small towns nearby, people began to tell her story, not Betsy's, but the witch's. They called her the Bell Witch of Tennessee, the voice that cursed a family and killed a man with words alone. Stories grew like vines, curling and twisting until they reached far beyond Adams. Some said she was the ghost of Kate Batts, a neighbor wronged in business. Others whispered she was a spirit far older, a guardian of the land, punished by human greed. Each storyteller added their own thread, and slowly the Bell Witch became something greater than truth. She became a mirror for every secret the South ever buried. Travelers came from distant states to stand in the Bell Witch Cave, a hollow carved by time along the Red River. They said strange sounds still echoed there. Faint whispers, laughter, the rustle of skirts through stone. A few claimed to see a shadowy figure standing at the mouth of the cave, waiting, watching. Yet the legend had softened over time. Where once her name was spoken in fear, it was now told in awe, as if the witch herself had transformed. From tormentor into tale-teller, children gathered by candlelight to hear of her power, her voice, her vengeance. Preachers used her story as warning. Dreamers used it as wonder. And always it began with a whisper. Back in Adams, the Bell Farm still stood, weathered, quiet, its wood gray from rain and sun. Travelers said if you stood there at dusk, when the sky bled orange over the fields, you could feel the air shift, like someone breathing beside you. Not menacing, not cruel, and only curious. As though the land remembered what it once held. Time, as it does, began to turn her into myth. But myths do not sleep. They move, they grow, they adapt. In the years after Betsy's passing, sightings continued. A flicker of light in the cave, an echo of laughter in the wind, voices murmuring in the cornfields. The Bell Witch had become a story that refused to end, whispered from one generation to the next, changing shape like smoke. Yet among those who listened closely, the historians, the locals, the dreamers, there lingered a strange tenderness toward her. For behind the horror lay something heartbreakingly human. A woman wronged, forgotten, voiceless, who found a way to be remembered. And so the Bell Witch became less of a curse and more of a reminder that stories, once silenced, will find their voice again, even if it must echo through centuries. There are nights still, along the Red River, when fog rolls low and the water whispers against the rocks. If you stand there long enough, in the hush between heartbeat and breeze, you might hear a voice. Faint, familiar, patient. It doesn't seek to frighten anymore. It simply says, I am still here. And then it fades, leaving only the sound of moving water, the rustle of leaves, and the long, deep breath of the earth remembering itself. For hauntings, after all, are not about death. They are about memory, about voices that could not rest until the world listened. And the Bell Witch, whether ghost or grief or something in between, had finally found what she sought. Not fear, not vengeance, but a place in the eternal hush of stories that never die. Still, as the world changed, as railroads came, and new towns grew, there were those who swore her presence could still be felt. They spoke of nights when animals froze mid-step, when lanterns flickered without wind, when a soft hum drifted through empty rooms. A reminder that though the Bell Witch had become legend, legends do not fade, they wait. And so, beneath the silver moonlight that once bathed the Bell Farm, her story lingered, neither past nor present, but something eternal, like the whisper of wind over water, like the voice of the earth itself breathing through time. As years turned into decades, the hills of Tennessee changed their face. New fences, new families, new roads carved through the quiet fields that once held the Bell family's sorrow. Yet the story never left. It clung to the soil like roots, whispering through the generations softly, insistently, as though the land itself refused to forget. By the late 1800s, children in Adams grew up hearing her name before they learned their prayers. The Bell Witch was no longer just a ghost. She had become part of the air itself. Farmers spoke of hearing her hum while plowing at dusk. Travelers along the river said their horses would stop without reason, their ears turning toward something unseen. And in homes near the old Bell property, candles would sometimes flicker in perfect rhythm, as though someone invisible were breathing in the same room. Some said she was Kate Batts still, her spirit tethered to the memory of betrayal. Others believed she had become something far older, a voice of justice that rose whenever truth was buried too deep. Whatever she was, she endured. Because stories that grow from pain never die easily. In the quiet town church, preachers began using her story in their sermons. Let no soul act in deceit, they warned. For the earth remembers what we hide. The congregation would nod solemnly. But when service ended and twilight stretched over the fields, they would speak in gentler tones. She was a woman wronged, they'd say softly. She only wanted to be heard. And so pity began to replace fear. By the early 1900s, her legend had spread across the South. Writers came to Adams, notebook in hand, chasing the ghost through every hollow and cave. They found locals eager to tell their own versions, each one different, each one a little truer than the last. One old man swore he'd seen a figure near the Red River on a fog-heavy night, her shape faint as smoke. He said she spoke without words. A thought pressed gently into his mind. You remember, don't you? Another claimed that when he was a boy, he'd heard laughter drifting from the Bell Witch cave. Not cruel, not mocking, but almost playful. Like someone remembering a happier time. It was as if the witch herself had mellowed with the passing years. Her fury cooled into something wistful. Her vengeance turned to memory. She was no longer the curse of one family, but the guardian of a story. A ghost who lingered to ensure that truth, once awakened, stayed alive. When the modern age arrived, trains, telephones, electric light, people said her voice faded. But in the still places, her presence lingered. In 1935, a group of boys exploring the Bell Witch Cave heard a whisper just beyond the torchlight. Go home, it said. They ran, their hearts pounding, and for weeks afterward, each dreamt of the same woman, pale, watching, sorrowful. Tourists began to visit. They came with flashlights and curiosity, not fear. And yet more than a few left pale, shaken, quiet. They spoke of sudden cold, of the feeling that someone stood just behind them, breathing softly against their ear. In time, the Bell Witch became a mirror for America's hunger for the strange. She was the ghost of guilt, the whisper of justice, the proof that stories are never really over. Films were made, books written, but none captured the quiet truth of her. None understood that her power was not in her rage, but in her remembrance. Even now, the Bell Witch Cave stands still beneath the Tennessee sky, its mouth dark, its air cool, the river humming nearby. Visitors who walk too far inside claim to hear a soft tapping in the stone, like a heartbeat, steady and patient. Some say it's water. Others swear it's her, waiting, listening, breathing through the dark. And on certain nights, when the air turns heavy and the stars feel close enough to touch, locals say they hear her again, not as a scream or curse, but as a whisper of wind moving through the trees, repeating one word over and over, remember. For in the end, that is all she ever wanted. Not revenge, not chaos, just remembrance. She was a voice silenced by time, and time, out of guilt or grace, chose to give her back her sound. Today, those who stand by the Bell Farm feel something strange, a pull, a hush, as though the earth itself leans closer to listen. And maybe that's what the Bell Witch became, not a ghost, not a warning, but a bridge between memory and myth. The story still lives, in campfire tales and documentaries, in the hearts of those who look for meaning in what refuses to die. And somewhere, deep beneath the hills of Tennessee, a single whisper still moves through the dark. Patient and unhurried, soft as breath. You remember me now? And perhaps that's all a haunting ever is. Not a punishment, but a plea for the living to listen. The world has grown loud since the days when the Bell family first heard her voice. Engines hum where crickets once sang. Neon light bleeds into the dark where moonlight used to rest. And yet, in the stillness between sounds, in the silence that lingers just before sleep, the Bell Witch still finds her way through. It begins softly, as most true things do, a faint breath of air against the curtains, a quiet unease that doesn't frighten, only reminds. Those who visit Adams today say the town feels gentle in daylight, but different at night. There's a weight to the silence there, like the land itself remembers every word ever spoken upon it. You can walk the narrow road past the Bell Farm and feel the air grow still, as if it too is waiting. Many come to the cave now, not with fear, but with reverence. They bring cameras, flashlights, and quiet wonder. They step into the mouth of the cave expecting a story, but leave with something harder to name. Some say the air hums faintly when no one speaks. Others feel a low vibration in the stone, like the earth holding its breath. And sometimes, when their lights flicker and go dim for a moment too long, they swear they hear a woman's voice. Not angry, not cruel, just whispering their name almost lovingly, as if testing how memory sounds when spoken aloud. In recent years, her legend has become a mirror to our age of noise. Podcasters chase her truth through static and speculation, their voices trembling between fascination and disbelief. Filmmakers come, eager to retell her story with sharper shadows and louder screams. But the true haunting was never about terror. It was about the ache of being forgotten. The Bell Witch was never a monster. She was a question. What happens when truth is buried and pain is ignored? What shape does justice take when no one listens? Through the retelling, her image has changed. In one film, she's a demon. In another, a grieving spirit. In another, just the wind in a hollow cave. But the land remembers her differently. The people who live nearby speak her name with quiet respect, as though mentioning a neighbor who has lived there longer than anyone else. They say her voice comes most clearly not to the fearful, but to the lonely. That those who carry hidden guilt or untold sorrow feel her presence like a soft weight on their chest, and not to punish, but to comfort. In 1998, a local woman visiting the cave alone claimed she felt a hand brush lightly across her shoulder. She turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but found only shadows and the slow drip of water echoing through the dark. She said she heard a voice then, so faint she couldn't tell if it came from the cave or her own thoughts, whispering, "You're not alone." And maybe that was the truth of her all along. Not vengeance, not hatred, just the desire to be seen, to remind the living that they are part of something vast and unseen, that the past never truly leaves. Outside the cave, the Red River still flows quietly. The same water that once carried the moon's reflection as the bells stood on its banks listening for her. Sometimes the current moves so gently it seems still, holding the sky without a ripple. Stand there long enough and the air begins to feel alive, as though every rustle, every sigh, every shift of wind carries her echo. For 200 years, the Bell Witch has remained, through whispers, through dreams, through the retelling of frightened hearts. And each time her story is told, it changes slightly. The way a lullaby softens over generations. That's what keeps her alive. Not the fear, but the remembering. She has become part of the American night, woven into the hush that falls when a story ends and the world holds its breath. Her legend sleeps under the soil of atoms, but her echo travels far beyond, across cities, screens, and the quiet spaces where people listen in the dark for something ancient and true. And perhaps even now, as you listen to these words, she listens too, not to frighten, but to remind you that every story ever told leaves something behind, that even in silence we are never truly alone. For the Bell Witch was never just a haunting. She was a voice, and voices once heard never fully fade. Night in Adam still falls softly. It moves like mist over the river, curling around the trees, folding into the silence that waits beneath every sound. There's no scream, no sudden terror anymore, only quiet. The kind of quiet that feels alive. And in that hush, her story continues to breathe. Locals say if you walk alone by the Bell Farm under a full moon, the earth hums faintly beneath your feet. They tell of a stillness that feels watchful, not menacing, just aware. Sometimes, it's said, you can hear laughter far away, light and fading, like a memory of joy carried by wind. And sometimes, a soft woman's voice hums a tune no one remembers, yet everyone feels they once knew. It is in these small, almost invisible moments that her legacy lives, not in the tales of terror, but in the reminder that everything we bury eventually finds a voice. The Bell Witch may have vanished from the world's eyes, but she lingers in its conscience, a quiet echo that refuses to be erased. As history moved forward and science claimed the world with its light, her shadow did not disappear. It softened. It became metaphor, myth, and meaning. Scholars began to write about her as the first American haunting, the mirror through which the young nation faced its guilt and superstition. They said she represented the price of silence, the weight of secrets too long carried. But in the hearts of those who still whispered her name, she was something else, a guardian of memory. And maybe that's what she wanted all along. There's an old story that many years after the last Bell descendant left the farm, a stranger came to Adams looking for the truth. He spoke with the elders, read every record, and spent a night by the river. When he returned to town at dawn, he was pale and quiet. "I didn't see her," he said softly, "but I think she saw me." He refused to say more. Those who heard him say there was no fear in his voice, only peace, as though some old question had finally been answered. Because maybe that is how hauntings truly end, not with an exorcism, not with banishment, but with understanding. When the living stop fearing the past and begin to listen to it instead. Over time, the Bell Witch's name spread far beyond Tennessee. She became a symbol of mystery, of storytelling, of that thin veil between what we know and what we feel. In books and documentaries, in whispered campfire retellings, her presence endures. And somewhere in that endurance lies the truth of her. For what are ghosts, if not echoes of love and pain too strong to fade? What is a haunting, if not memory itself? Reaching back through the dark, asking us to remember? The Bell Witch began as anger. She became legend. But she ends, softly, as understanding. A voice that reminds us that even in the darkest stories there is a kind of grace. If you listen closely tonight, wherever you are, maybe near the woods, or by a quiet window as the wind moves, you might hear it. The faintest whisper, no louder than breath, slipping through the hush between heartbeats. It will not frighten you. It will only remind you that stories are alive. That memory has a soul, that somewhere in the Tennessee dark, a woman's whisper still drifts through the trees, patient and eternal. And if you close your eyes, you may hear her say, "You've listened." That's enough. Then the wind will fade, and the silence will settle again, gentle, complete, forgiving. For that is how all true hauntings end, not in terror, but in peace. If these words carried you a little closer to stillness tonight, let this channel stay by your side too. A quiet voice in the dark, where stories rest and dreams begin. And so the hills of Tennessee sleep again. The moon drifts slowly over the Red River, touching the fields where memory hums beneath the soil. The Bell House is gone now, only the whisper remains, moving gently through time, like breath through the hollow of a dream. Perhaps that's how all stories should end, not with answers, but with quiet. Not with fear, but with the soft ache of remembrance. For in every legend there lies a truth too tender to name, and in every haunting, a heart that only wished to be heard. The Bell Witch has become the night itself, not a ghost to fear, but a voice to remember. And as you drift towards sleep, let her whisper remind you, history never truly leaves us. It only waits, in the silence, in the shadows, in the spaces between our thoughts. Good night. And may the echoes that linger bring you peace, not fear, until the next story finds you, beneath the hush of another moonlit sky.